What happens when arrogance blinds justice? When those who abuse power believe they are untouchable. A white police officer walks into court, shoving a black woman into the defendant's chair, mocking her, dismissing her. The room assumes it's just another routine case. But today, power shifts. And by the time the truth is revealed, it will be too late for the one who thought she was in control. The doors of the courthouse swung open, and Officer Rachel Monroe strode in, gripping the handcuffed wrist of a black woman beside her. With a sharp shove, Rachel forced the woman into the defendant's chair, her lips curling into a smirk. "Sit down and behave," she sneered. "Let's get this over with." The room barely reacted. To them, this was nothing unusual, just another arrest, just another defendant being dragged before the law. Rachel strutted toward the prosecution's table, slamming a thick file onto the desk. Papers scattered across the polished wood, but she didn't care. "That's her case file," she said, her tone dripping with contempt. "Make it quick. She's just another scam artist." The air in the room shifted slightly, but Rachel didn't notice. She was too busy enjoying herself. From the defense side, the black woman said nothing. She sat still, her expression unreadable, her hands resting gently on the table, as if she had all the time in the world. Rachel snorted. "You won't be so calm when this is over." The door behind the bench creaked open, and the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Evelyn Harper." The entire courtroom stood, except for Rachel. She crossed her arms, rolling her eyes. The court clerk turned toward her, frowning. "Officer Monroe, please stand." Rachel exhaled loudly, shifting her weight. "Relax," she muttered, barely making an effort. The clerk's disapproving stare lingered, but Rachel ignored it. The judge finally took her seat. Rachel, still standing, picked up the case file and dropped it onto the bench with a loud thud. "There. Everything you need," she said dismissively. "This one's a fraud. Just process her already." The room fell silent. Rachel frowned, glancing around. Something felt off. She turned back to the judge, expecting the usual nod of agreement. Instead, Judge Evelyn Harper was staring at her. Not at the file. Not at the defendant. At her. Rachel blinked. "What?" Judge Harper lifted the file, flipping through the pages slowly. No reaction. No words. Just the quiet rustling of paper. Rachel shifted uncomfortably. Something about the way the judge was reading, so slow, so deliberate, sent a prickle up her spine. Then, Judge Harper finally spoke. Her voice was calm, almost amused. "Officer Monroe," she said, lifting her gaze. "Are you sure about this?" Rachel let out a dry laugh. "Am I sure?" She jabbed a thumb toward the black woman sitting at the defense table. "She's a liar, a con artist." Caught her red-handed. The judge nodded slowly. "I see." She closed the file with a sharp snap. And then, she stood. Placing both hands firmly on the bench, she leaned forward slightly. Rachel's stomach twisted. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. A lawyer shifted uncomfortably in the jury box, whispering to a colleague. "Something's wrong." Rachel's pulse quickened. The judge's next words came slowly, carefully measured. "Officer Monroe," she said, "do you know who this woman is?" Rachel scoffed, folding her arms. "Like I said, she's a fraud." Judge Harper exhaled softly, shaking her head. "That's unfortunate," she murmured. Rachel frowned. "What is?" The judge's gaze locked onto hers. "That you didn't recognize me." A heavy, crushing silence fell over the room. Rachel froze. A few people in the audience gasped softly. A clerk's pen slipped from their fingers, clattering onto the floor. Rachel's breath hitched. Her eyes darted toward the defense table, toward the black woman she had dragged in like a common criminal. The woman, still calm, still composed, was watching her. And now, Rachel finally saw it. The power in her stare. The way she carried herself. A memory slammed into Rachel's mind. A newspaper article. A photo. A woman in judge's robes, standing in front of the Supreme Court. The name beneath it. Honorable Evelyn Harper. Rachel's throat went dry. Judge Harper straightened, adjusting her sleeves. "Officer Monroe," she said smoothly, "I believe you've made a terrible mistake." Rachel's world tilted. She had just dragged a sitting judge, the presiding judge, into her own courtroom. In handcuffs. The courtroom erupted. And in the chaos, Judge Harper simply smiled. Rachel Monroe's chest tightened as Judge Evelyn Harper's words echoed through the room. "I believe you've made a terrible mistake." The courtroom erupted, voices overlapping in shock and disbelief. What did she just say? Did that officer seriously arrest the judge? Rachel's mind reeled, her breath quickening. No, no, this wasn't possible. She turned to the black woman still seated calmly at the defense table, the same woman she had shoved, mocked, and dismissed just minutes ago. Judge Evelyn Harper, a Superior Court judge, the presiding judge of this case. Rachel's hands grew clammy, but she forced herself to scoff. This is some kind of joke, right? She snapped. She's a criminal. I caught her committing fraud. We have the evidence. She reached for the case file, flipping through it, as if the documents inside would somehow erase the truth staring her in the face. But the courtroom had changed. The energy in the room had shifted. A lawyer in the jury box whispered to a colleague. A bailiff shifted uncomfortably, suddenly unsure of his stance. And in the back of the room, another police officer had gone pale, sweat beading at his forehead. He knew something Rachel didn't. Judge Harper tilted her head slightly, watching Rachel with unsettling patience. Then she spoke. Officer Monroe, she said evenly. Tell me, when you arrested me, did you run my name through the system? Rachel opened her mouth. Stopped. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She hadn't. She had seen a black woman in an expensive suit at an office building she thought she didn't belong in. She had assumed. And now, that assumption was about to end her career. A choking silence filled the courtroom. The prosecutor, who had been ready to present his case, now looked like he wanted to disappear. Rachel's mind raced for a way out. There has to be a mistake, she said, grasping at anything. Maybe you're impersonating a judge. A few people in the audience snickered. Judge Harper chuckled softly. Officer Monroe, she said, her tone still infuriatingly calm. Do you know what happens when a sitting judge is falsely arrested? Rachel had no words. Judge Harper stood slowly, adjusting her blazer. And then, she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, polished, and gleaming under the courtroom lights. She placed it gently on the table. The golden emblem of the United States judiciary. Silence. Then, the prosecutor, who had been watching this unfold in stunned disbelief, suddenly stiffened. He grabbed the case file Rachel had thrown onto his desk and flipped to the arrest report. His face turned ghostly pale. Judge Harper folded her arms. Read it. The prosecutor swallowed. Hard. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he read the name aloud. Evelyn Harper, Superior Court Judge. Rachel felt the room spin. This couldn't be happening. The courtroom exploded into chaos. You arrested a judge? Someone gasped. Jesus, she's finished. The bailiff, who had been standing near the judge's bench, instinctively stepped back. The court clerk, still seated, covered his mouth with his hands. Rachel gritted her teeth, her panic bubbling under the surface. Judge Harper leaned forward, placing her hands on the table. You paraded me in here like a common criminal, she said, her voice low and powerful. You humiliated me. You ignored protocol, skipped proper identification, and violated my rights. She let the words sink in. Tell me, Officer Monroe, she continued, is this how you conduct all your arrests? Rachel opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Judge Harper's eyes gleamed with something dangerous. Because if so, she murmured, we have a much bigger problem than my wrongful arrest. Rachel's breath came fast and shallow. Her fingers trembled at her sides. This was bad. Worse than bad. And then, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A new voice rang out. That won't be necessary, Your Honor. Rachel turned sharply, and her blood ran cold. A team of internal affairs investigators stepped forward, their faces grim, unyielding. The lead investigator held up a folded document. A warrant. Officer Monroe, he said, as of this moment, you are under internal review for misconduct, unlawful arrest, and abuse of power. Rachel staggered back. No, she whispered. No, this isn't happening. But the investigator was already stepping forward. Please place your hands where we can see them. Rachel turned wildly, her eyes darting across the courtroom, looking for someone, anyone, to back her up. But no one moved. Not the prosecutor. Not the bailiffs. Not the judge's clerks. They all knew the truth now. Rachel Monroe was alone. And then, for the first time, she understood. She hadn't just arrested the wrong person. She had just destroyed her own career. Judge Harper tilted her head slightly, watching Rachel with the same calm patience she had shown from the start. It's unfortunate, she said softly. But you only have yourself to blame. Rachel's breath hitched. A pair of handcuffs clicked open behind her. And she knew this was the end. Rachel Monroe's breath hitched as the internal affairs investigator took another step toward her, his expression unreadable. The polished metallic handcuffs in his hands gleamed under the courtroom lights, the same ones she had used on Judge Harper just minutes ago. This isn't happening. Rachel's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her pulse pounding in her ears. She could feel the eyes of the entire courtroom drilling into her, watching, waiting, judging. No one was coming to her defense. Not the prosecutor. Not the court clerks. Not even her fellow officers in the back of the room. Because they all knew the truth now. And she was the one on trial. The internal affairs investigator, a tall man with sharp eyes and a crisp suit, held up the folded document in his hands. Officer Rachel Monroe, he said, his voice calm but firm, as of this moment, you are placed under internal review for misconduct, wrongful arrest, and abuse of authority. Rachel shook her head sharply. This is insane. I was just doing my job. Judge Evelyn Harper remained standing behind the bench, watching Rachel with quiet, unshaken authority. Your job, the judge echoed, arching an eyebrow. Tell me, Officer Monroe, what part of your job allows you to drag a sitting judge into her own courtroom in handcuffs? Rachel opened her mouth, closed it. There was no answer that would save her now. The IA investigator sighed. Officer Monroe, please place your hands where we can see them. Rachel stumbled back, panic clawing at her throat. You can't do this, she snapped. This is a misunderstanding. I didn't know she was a judge. Judge Harper's gaze sharpened like a blade. And why is that? She asked, her voice deadly calm. Rachel hesitated. She could feel the room holding its breath, waiting for her to say it. Because she hadn't checked. Because she had assumed. Because she had looked at a well-dressed black woman in an office building and decided, without question, that she was a criminal. And now, she was the one being judged. Her mouth went dry. I don't have to answer that. Judge Harper's expression didn't change. That's what I thought. The IA investigator took another step forward, reaching for his radio. Dispatch, we need a transport unit at the courthouse. We have an officer in custody. Rachel's stomach dropped. The words felt unreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. In the back of the room, Officer Brad Stevens, the one who had been sweating earlier, looked like he wanted to disappear. Rachel's mind raced. She wasn't going down alone. She turned, pointing a trembling finger at Stevens. You knew, she snapped. You were there. You told me she was a suspect. Stevens went pale as a sheet. All heads turned toward him. Judge Harper's eyes narrowed slightly. Officer Stevens, she said smoothly, is that true? Stevens stammered, his hands visibly shaking. I mean, Rachel said. Rachel cut him off. Don't lie. You backed me up. You said she looked suspicious. The room shifted. And suddenly, Internal Affairs wasn't just looking at Rachel anymore. The investigator frowned. Officer Stevens, were you involved in this arrest? Stevens froze. Sweat dripped down his temple. He stammered. Judge Harper leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but sharp as a knife. You might want to think carefully before you answer. Rachel smirked internally. If she was going down, she was taking someone with her. Stevens swallowed hard. He knew, if he denied it, Rachel would throw him under the bus anyway. His lips parted, ready to say something, anything to get himself out of this. But before he could, the courtroom doors swung open again. Another group of uniformed officers entered, their faces grim. This time, it wasn't Internal Affairs. It was the FBI. Rachel's breath caught. The lead agent, a woman in a dark blue suit, held up her badge. Special Agent Diane Foster, FBI, she announced. We're here on orders from the Department of Justice. Rachel stiffened. Judge Harper raised an eyebrow. And what exactly is the Department of Justice interested in today? Agent Foster's gaze locked onto Rachel. We've been conducting a federal investigation into corruption within certain law enforcement departments, she said. And Officer Monroe just led us straight to one of our primary targets. Rachel felt like the ground had just vanished beneath her. What? She choked out. That's ridiculous. I was just making an arrest. Agent Foster nodded. Yes. And in doing so, you exposed something much bigger than you realized. She pulled a thick folder from her briefcase and handed it to Judge Harper. The judge flipped through the pages, her jaw tightening. Finally, she looked up, as burning with something fiercer than before. Well, Judge Harper said, closing the folder with a satisfying snap, it looks like this case just got a lot more interesting. Rachel barely heard anything else. Her vision blurred, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The IA investigator stepped forward, taking hold of her wrist. "Officer Monroe," he said, "turn around." Rachel jerked away. "No. This is a mistake. This isn't." The agent's grip tightened. "This isn't a request." And before she could fight back, the cold metal of handcuffs snapped around her wrists. Rachel Monroe, the officer who had walked into the courtroom full of arrogance and control, was now the one being led out in chains. And as the doors closed behind her, the last thing she saw was Judge Evelyn Harper watching her go, calm, steady, unshaken. The courtroom had just witnessed a downfall. And this was only the beginning. Rachel Monroe's wrist burned as the cold steel of the handcuffs dug into her skin. This couldn't be happening. She had walked into this courthouse in complete control, mocking the woman she believed to be a fraud, expecting to win as she always did. Now, she was the one being dragged out like a criminal. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she was led through the hallway, past a sea of reporters who had already caught wind of the chaos inside the courtroom. Cameras flashed violently, microphones were shoved toward her face, and voices shouted over each other. "Officer Monroe, do you have any comments about your arrest? Is it true you wrongfully arrested a sitting judge? Internal Affairs has been investigating you. What do you have to say?" Rachel gritted her teeth, trying to block it all out. The FBI agents on either side of her pushed forward, ignoring the chaos, until they reached an unmarked black SUV parked just outside the courthouse steps. One of them, Agent Foster, opened the door and gestured inside. "Get in." Rachel hesitated. "Where are you taking me?" Foster gave her a cool, unreadable look. "To get some answers." Rachel swallowed hard. She had no choice. She climbed inside, and the door slammed shut behind her. An hour later, Rachel sat in a cold, gray interrogation room, her wrists now free from cuffs but not from suspicion. Agent Foster sat across from her, a thick file on the table between them. Rachel stared at it, her throat dry. "I don't know what you think you have on me," she said, forcing confidence into her voice, "but this is ridiculous. I was just doing my job." Foster remained silent for a moment, watching her like a hawk. Then, she slid the file forward and opened it. The first page contained dozens of complaints filed against Rachel over the past 5 years. Rachel's stomach twisted. Excessive force. Misconduct. Racial profiling. All dismissed. Every single one. Foster tapped the page. "Recognize these?" Rachel forced a smirk. "If they were dismissed, then they don't mean anything." Foster didn't react. She turned to the next page. Bank statements. Rachel felt her pulse quicken. A list of deposits into her personal account, amounts that didn't match her salary. Foster finally spoke. "You've been taking money under the table." Rachel stiffened. "That's a lie." Foster raised an eyebrow. "Is it? Because according to these documents, you've received multiple payments from private security firms and, oh, look at this, businesses tied to law enforcement unions. Care to explain?" Rachel's mouth went dry. She knew she had taken a few favors here and there, but nothing serious. Nothing that should have put her in this seat. "That's not illegal," she said quickly. "Maybe I took a couple of consulting gigs." Foster cut her off. "Rachel," she said, voice sharp, "stop lying to yourself." Rachel flinched. "You didn't just arrest the wrong person today," Foster continued, flipping another page. "You exposed something much bigger." She turned the file toward Rachel, revealing a list of officers, prosecutors, and judges. Rachel's eyes darted across the names. Some she recognized. Some she didn't. But one name stood out. Officer Brad Stevens. Rachel's breath hitched. Foster noticed. "Ah," she murmured. "That one got your attention." Rachel clenched her fists. "What does Stevens have to do with this?" Foster leaned back. "He's been working with Internal Affairs, gathering evidence." Rachel felt her stomach drop. "Stevens? The coward she had tried to throw under the bus?" "He gave us everything," Foster continued. "Names, transactions, even a list of officers who covered up wrongful arrests, including yours." Rachel's hands shook. She had trusted him. Foster exhaled. "You thought you were untouchable, Officer Monroe. You thought you could keep playing the system, bending the rules, pushing the boundaries of the badge." She leaned forward, voice lowering. "But the system you abused? It just turned on you." Rachel's pulse thundered. This wasn't just about her arrest. This was about everything she had built. Her reputation, her career, her future. And now? She was about to lose it all. Rachel Monroe sat frozen, her mind spinning as Special Agent Foster's words echoed in her head. "The system you abused? It just turned on you." Across the interrogation table, Foster remained calm, composed, like a hunter watching its prey realize it had just stepped into a trap. Rachel's chest tightened as she stared down at the file in front of her. The list of names, the financial records, the documented complaints, it was all there. And worst of all, Officer Brad Stevens. The man she had trusted. The man she had just tried to throw under the bus. Rachel's jaw clenched. Stevens isn't smart enough to pull something like this off on his own. Foster arched an eyebrow. No, but he was smart enough to realize when the walls were closing in. And unlike you, he knew when to flip sides. Rachel's stomach twisted. You're lying, she said, though her voice lacked the certainty she wished it had. Foster smirked, then reached for the folder, flipping to another piece of damning evidence. A signed affidavit. Rachel leaned forward, heart hammering. At the bottom of the page was Stevens' signature. Her hands curled into fists. That bastard, she muttered under her breath. Foster didn't react. Stevens gave us names, Monroe. Names of officers who took bribes. Names of judges who pushed cases through without evidence. And, of course, she tapped the paper. The names of officers who falsified arrests. Rachel's breath caught. Foster continued, cool and steady. He gave us the details on at least 5 cases where you falsified evidence. Pulled people in without proper cause. Forced false confessions. Rachel gritted her teeth. Those people were criminals. Were they? Foster challenged. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like some of them were just easy targets. Rachel's fingers twitched. She hadn't been careful enough. And now? She was the one sitting in an interrogation room, trapped under the very laws she had once manipulated. Foster sighed, leaning back. Here's the thing, Monroe. You're not the first cop we've pulled in for this. You won't be the last. But if you want to walk out of here with anything left, you need to start talking. Rachel narrowed her eyes. And if I don't? Foster smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Then Internal Affairs and the DOJ will bury you. You'll lose your badge, your pension, your freedom. And when the dust settles, she shrugged. No one will remember your name. Rachel's heartbeat thundered. Her mind raced, searching for a way out. She needed an angle, a way to turn this in her favor. And then it hit her. Rachel sat back, forcing a smirk onto her face. You think Stevens gave you everything? She asked, tilting her head. Foster's expression didn't change. Rachel chuckled. He didn't. Because if I go down, so do a hell of a lot of people above me. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. You're looking in the wrong place, Agent Foster. You think I'm the big catch? I'm nothing compared to who's really running this operation. Foster watched her carefully. Go on. Rachel's smirk widened. If you want the real names? The ones no one dares to touch. She shrugged. I want a deal. Foster didn't react at first. Then she closed the file, her sharp gaze never leaving Rachel. We'll see. Rachel knew that look. Foster wasn't convinced yet. But she would be. Because Rachel still had one last card to play. And she was about to turn the entire game upside down. Rachel Monroe leaned back in her chair, her smirk unwavering as she watched Special Agent Foster consider her words. I want a deal. Foster remained silent, her sharp eyes studying Rachel like a puzzle that almost made sense, but not quite. Rachel knew that look. It was the same expression she had worn herself countless times when interrogating a suspect. And right now, she was the suspect. The irony wasn't lost on her. Foster finally spoke. You're in no position to negotiate, Monroe. Rachel chuckled, shaking her head. That's where you're wrong. She leaned forward, placing her cuffed hands on the table. You think Stevens gave you everything? She asked. Then tell me this. Why haven't you made a single arrest outside of the officers in this room? Foster's expression remained unreadable, but Rachel saw the slight tightening of her jaw. She was right. Stevens had flipped, but he had only given them the lower-level names. The officers. The ones like her. The real players? The ones pulling the strings? They were still out there. Untouched. Protected. Watching. Rachel's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You want the names of the real people running this? The ones at the top? The ones who make people like me look like amateurs. She tilted her head, then cut me a deal. A heavy silence settled over the room. Foster sat back, crossing her arms. Why should I believe you? Rachel smirked. Because if you don't, you'll never take them down. Another pause. Then Foster sighed, rubbing her temple. You really think you're worth that much? Rachel's smirk didn't falter. I know I am. Foster exhaled slowly. She was considering it. Rachel had her hooked. Foster glanced at the 2 other agents standing by the door. With a nod, she gestured for them to step outside. Rachel's heart pounded. The door clicked shut, leaving them alone. Foster leaned forward, lowering her voice. Talk. Rachel's pulse steadied. This was her moment. She took a slow breath. And then she dropped the bomb. The orders don't come from the precinct, she said. Not entirely. They don't even come from the police chief. Foster's eyes narrowed. Rachel leaned closer. The real orders? She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. They come from inside the courthouse. Foster's face remained blank, but Rachel saw the slight flicker of surprise. The judges, Rachel continued. Not all of them, but enough. The ones who control which cases move forward, which ones disappear. She tilted her head. The ones who decide who gets a fair trial and who doesn't. Foster was quiet for too long. Rachel grinned. You already suspected it, didn't you? Foster's jaw tightened. Rachel had her answer. The FBI knew, but they didn't have proof. Not yet. Rachel sat back, letting the moment stretch. Give me immunity, she said, voice calm, controlled. And I'll give you everything. Foster tapped her fingers against the table. You don't have immunity to offer. That's up to the DOJ. Then take me to them. Foster stared at her for a long moment. Then as she stood, Rachel's heart pounded faster. This was it. Foster pulled out her phone, pressing a number. Yeah, bring the director in. Rachel smiled. She had just shifted the entire game. Rachel Monroe kept her expression steady, but inside, her nerves were on fire. She had just given the FBI a reason to keep her alive. Now, she had to make sure they needed her enough to cut her a deal. Across the table, Special Agent Foster remained stone-faced, but Rachel could tell she had her attention now. A few minutes later, the door swung open, and a tall, graying man in a government-issued suit walked in. Rachel knew him instantly. Deputy Director Mark Calloway. He was high up, not just in the FBI, but in the entire Department of Justice. If he was here, that meant one thing. She had just escalated this to a national level. Calloway sat down across from her, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. Officer Monroe, he said, his voice calm, authoritative. Agent Foster tells me you have information worth trading. Rachel tilted her head slightly, sizing him up. That depends. You offering something worth taking? Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. You misunderstand your position, he said. You're in no place to negotiate. Rachel smirked. Then why did you come down here yourself? A flicker of annoyance crossed Calloway's face, but it was gone in an instant. Foster leaned forward. You say the corruption goes beyond the police force, that it leads back to the courthouse. Rachel nodded. That's right. Calloway folded his hands on the table. Names. Rachel shook her head. Not yet. Calloway's expression darkened. Then we have nothing to discuss. He started to rise from his seat, but Rachel spoke again, just loud enough to stop him in his tracks. Ever heard of Judge Raymond Lockwood? Calloway froze. Foster's eyes snapped to Rachel, her mask of indifference cracking for the first time. Rachel smiled. Bingo. She had hit a nerve. Calloway slowly lowered himself back into his chair. His gaze was sharper now, his posture different, less dismissive, more alert. Rachel leaned back. So I'm guessing that means yes. Foster's jaw tightened. Lockwood is untouchable. Rachel chuckled, shaking her head. Not anymore. She rested her cuffed hands on the table and leaned in. You want to know how deep this goes? She said. Lockwood isn't just involved. He's running the entire operation. Calloway and Foster exchanged a glance. Rachel knew what they were thinking. If this was true, it changed everything. Calloway's face remained unreadable. Prove it. Rachel took a slow breath. This was the moment. You already have the bank records from my account, she said. Look deeper. Follow the money trail. I wasn't the only one getting paid off. You'll find transactions leading straight to Lockwood's shell companies. She tapped the table. He's been laundering bribes through fake legal firms for years. Any officer, prosecutor, or judge willing to play along gets paid. Anyone who steps out of line? They disappear. Calloway's face remained unreadable, but Foster looked like she had just swallowed glass. Rachel continued. You want something bigger? Check the case dismissals from the past 5 years in Lockwood's court. Find the ones involving politicians, CEOs, high-profile criminals. You'll see a pattern. She tilted her head. Lockwood isn't just taking bribes. He's deciding who walks free and who doesn't. He's controlling the justice system from the inside. Silence blanketed the room. Foster's fingers curled into fists, and Rachel saw it, the moment she realized she believed her. Calloway was harder to read. He sat back, exhaling through his nose, thinking, calculating. Finally, he spoke. You're right about one thing, Monroe. Rachel arched an eyebrow. Only one. He ignored her sarcasm. If what you're saying is true, he continued, then this is bigger than we thought. But hearsay isn't enough. We need hard evidence. Rachel nodded. Then I'll get it for you. Foster scoffed. And why the hell would we trust you to do that? Rachel smirked. Because I want something in return. Calloway's expression didn't change. You want immunity. Rachel leaned back in her chair. For starters, Foster looked like she wanted to strangle her. You don't get to walk free, Monroe. Rachel shrugged. Fine. Then give me a lesser sentence. Protect my pension. Make sure I don't rot in prison for the next 30 years while your department gets all the credit. Calloway tapped his fingers against the table, considering. You said you can get us hard evidence, he said finally. How? Rachel smiled. Because I wasn't just on the payroll. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. I was in the meetings. I know how they communicate, where they store their files. Hell, I can even tell you which judges use burner phones. She leaned forward, lowering her voice to a whisper. I can give you Lockwood. A tense silence stretched across the room. Then, finally, Calloway nodded. Fine, he said. You help us take Lockwood down, and we'll discuss your terms. Rachel grinned. Smart choice. She had just saved herself. Now, all she had to do was survive long enough to take down the most powerful judge in the state. Rachel Monroe knew the moment the deal was struck. She had just bought herself time. But time was a dangerous thing in a game like this. She had just named Judge Raymond Lockwood, one of the most powerful and untouchable figures in the justice system. And now, if Lockwood caught wind that she had flipped, she wouldn't make it to trial. Deputy Director Calloway leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the table. His cold blue eyes studied her, measuring how much she was worth. Special Agent Foster still looked like she wanted to strangle Rachel on principle, but she stayed silent. Finally, Calloway spoke. Let's say we believe you. Let's say Lockwood really is running this operation. How do you prove it? Rachel exhaled slowly, keeping her voice even. Lockwood is careful, she said. He doesn't leave a paper trail. He doesn't talk over the phone. He meets in person. Always. Foster folded her arms. So what's your play? Rachel smirked. Simple. I get him to meet me. Calloway arched an eyebrow. And how do you plan to do that? He already thinks you're in custody. Rachel's smirk widened. That's exactly why he'll meet me. Because I'll make him think I can still be useful. Silence. Then, Foster scoffed. You expect us to just let you walk out of here and call him? Rachel shrugged. It's either that, or you wait for a miracle. Calloway exchanged a glance with Foster, then turned back to Rachel. You get one chance, Monroe, he said. One shot to make this happen. You mess this up, and we throw you back in your cell. Rachel's smirk didn't waver. I won't mess this up. An hour later, Rachel sat in a secure safe house, a burner phone resting in her hand. A hidden FBI team surrounded the building, monitoring every move she made. She had one job, make Lockwood believe she was still on his side. She took a slow breath, then dialed the number she knew by heart. The phone rang twice. Then, a click. A smooth, controlled voice answered. Rachel, Judge Raymond Lockwood said. I was wondering when you'd call. Rachel's pulse steadied. She had expected this. Lockwood was too smart to act surprised. But she had to play her part perfectly. I need to see you, she said, keeping her voice low, urgent. A pause. Then why? Rachel swallowed, injecting just the right amount of desperation into her tone. The FBI is onto me, she said. They pulled me in for questioning. They have Stevens. It's only a matter of time before they come for you. Another pause. Then, Lockwood chuckled. I see. And you want me to what? Clean up your mess. Rachel's fingers tightened around the phone. No, she said quickly. I just need to know what to do. How to fix this. Silence. Then, Lockwood sighed. You always were ambitious, Rachel. But ambition without caution. He tissed softly. That's how people get buried. Rachel forced a nervous laugh. Then tell me how not to get buried. Lockwood didn't answer right away. Finally. Fine. Meet me at the old courthouse parking lot. Midnight. Alone. Rachel let out a slow breath, as if relieved. I'll be there. The line went dead. Rachel set the phone down, exhaling slowly. She had done it. Lockwood had taken the bait. Now, all she had to do was walk into the lion's den and survive. She looked up at Foster and Calloway, who had been listening through the wire. Foster's jaw was tight, but Calloway simply nodded. You got him, he said. Rachel smiled, but deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. The air was thick with tension as Rachel Monroe stood in the dimly lit parking lot of the old courthouse, waiting for Judge Raymond Lockwood. A cold wind cut through the night, rustling debris on the cracked pavement. The building behind her, once a place of law, had long been abandoned, a fitting meeting spot for corruption to thrive. She checked her watch. 11:58 p.m. The FBI was stationed nearby, out of sight, but ready to descend at a moment's notice. Rachel knew they wouldn't move until she gave the signal. She had one job: get Lockwood to confess. And then, in this, a set of headlights appeared in the distance, slicing through the darkness. Rachel's heartbeat steadied. This was it. The black luxury sedan pulled up smoothly, the engine purring like a predator lying in wait. The back door opened. Judge Raymond Lockwood stepped out, his movements controlled, his presence suffocating. He wasn't in his judge's robe tonight. No. Tonight, he was exactly what he really was: a kingpin in a suit. Rachel forced herself to remain calm, unreadable. Lockwood's eyes swept over her, his expression unbothered, amused. "You look nervous, Rachel," he said smoothly. "Not as confident as you were the last time we spoke." Rachel gave a tight-lipped smile, forcing a chuckle. "Hard to be confident when the FBI is breathing down my neck." Lockwood took a slow step closer. "And whose fault is that?" Rachel held his gaze. Stevens folded. "The feds know about the bribes, the fake dismissals, the money laundering. They know about you." Lockwood sighed, shaking his head. "I told you before, only fools get caught." Rachel clenched her jaw. She needed him to say it outright. She needed him to admit it. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head like she was frustrated. "You don't get it, do you? They have records, bank statements, deposits from your shell companies. I didn't want to believe it myself, but it's all there." Lockwood smirked. "And what do you want me to do about it?" Rachel steeled herself. "I want out." The words hung in the air. Lockwood studied her for a long moment. Then he chuckled. "You're finally thinking like a survivor," he murmured. Rachel felt her stomach twist, but she held her ground. Lockwood stepped even closer, his voice lowering. "You want out," he said. "Then you'd better prove you're still useful." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Lockwood tilted his head slightly, a calculated smirk forming. "You're going to take care of our little problem," he said. "You're going to handle Stevens." Rachel's blood ran cold. This was it. If she hesitated, if she gave away even a flicker of doubt, he'd know. So she played her role. She scoffed. "You want me to take him out?" Lockwood smiled. "You were always good at cleaning up messes, Rachel. And right now, you're the only one left who can fix this." Rachel's fingers twitched slightly, her signal to the FBI. They were listening, recording, waiting. She needed just one more push. So she smirked, crossing her arms. "And if I do?" Lockwood grinned. "You get your life back," he said. "I'll make sure Internal Affairs buries your case. Your record stays clean. And in return," his voice lowered even more, the weight of his words suffocating, "you do exactly what I say when I say it. No more questions." Rachel felt the weight of his offer. This was his test. If she agreed, he'd know she was still loyal. If she hesitated, he'd know she was a rat. The air felt thick, suffocating. Rachel exhaled, smirked, and said the words that would seal his fate. "Consider it done." A slow, pleased smile spread across Lockwood's face. "Good girl." Rachel's fingers twitched again, her second signal. The air shifted. Then, red and blue lights flooded the parking lot. FBI. Hands in the air. Lockwood's smile vanished. Rachel stepped back as agents swarmed the area, guns drawn, voices booming commands. Lockwood turned sharply to her, eyes blazing. "You?" Rachel grinned. Surprise. Agents rushed him, forcing him against his own car, slapping handcuffs onto his wrists. "You have the right to remain silent," one of them barked. Lockwood laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "You really think this means anything?" he said, his voice eerily calm. Rachel stepped closer, looking him dead in the eye. "I think you're done," she said. Lockwood chuckled darkly. "You still don't get it, do you?" he murmured. Rachel frowned. "Get what?" Lockwood leaned in slightly, his eyes gleaming with something terrifyingly confident. "You weren't the only one I paid off." Rachel's stomach dropped. And then, gunshots erupted from the shadows. Gunfire erupted from the darkness, bullets shattering windshields, kicking up dust and debris across the abandoned parking lot. Rachel Monroe hit the ground hard, rolling behind Lockwood's black sedan for cover. Her heart pounded, adrenaline surging through her veins. This wasn't a rescue attempt. This was Lockwood's backup. The very people the FBI had failed to account for. FBI, take cover. Special Agent Foster's voice cut through the chaos. Agents scrambling for protection behind vehicles. Rachel pressed herself against the cool metal of the car, glancing across the lot. Shadowy figures emerged from behind nearby buildings, silencers glinting under the streetlights. Lockwood hadn't just expected this. He had planned for it. A dark, chilling laugh pulled Rachel's attention back. She turned, only to see Lockwood still standing, hands cuffed behind his back, smiling. "You didn't think I came alone, did you?" he said smoothly, barely flinching as gunfire ripped through the air. Rachel's jaw tightened. "Foster," she shouted. "Get him in the car and move." But before the agents could react, a black SUV screeched into the lot, tires burning against the pavement. Rachel's stomach dropped. The doors flew open. More armed men stepped out. And in the chaos, one of them moved straight for Lockwood. Rachel didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, ramming her shoulder into him just as a bullet flew past her head. Lockwood staggered, his balance thrown. Rachel grabbed the gun from the fallen FBI agent beside her, rolling onto her knees, and fired. A single shot, straight into the leg of the man reaching for Lockwood. He collapsed with a scream. Rachel pivoted, swinging the gun toward Lockwood himself. "Call them OFF," she barked. But Lockwood only grinned. "You don't get it, do you?" he murmured. "This doesn't end with me." Rachel's finger tensed on the trigger. "You don't start talking, it ends right now." Lockwood's eyes gleamed. "You wouldn't shoot a judge." Rachel smirked. "I would if he's a traitor." For the first time, Lockwood's smirk faltered. Behind her, the remaining FBI agents regained their positions, returning fire. The mercenaries, realizing they were losing ground, began falling back toward their vehicles. One of them grabbed the wounded man Rachel had shot, dragging him into the SUV. A voice from inside barked an order. "Leave Lockwood. We're compromised." Rachel's stomach clenched. They weren't here to rescue Lockwood. They were here to silence him. That was the plan all along. A disposable asset. A pawn sacrificed to protect the king. Rachel grabbed him by the collar, yanking him toward her. "Who gave the kill order?" she demanded. Lockwood only laughed softly, shaking his head. "You're asking the wrong question." Rachel gritted her teeth. And then, the SUV's engine roared to life. Rachel turned just in time to see one of the mercenaries raise a gun from inside the vehicle, aimed directly at Lockwood. Her body moved before her mind did. She shoved Lockwood down, twisting. The gun went off. A sharp pain tore through Rachel's side. For a moment, everything blurred. She hit the pavement, a dull ringing in her ears. The SUV peeled away, disappearing into the night. The gunfire stopped. All that remained were the groans of wounded men, the distant wail of sirens closing in. Rachel blinked, her vision swimming. Her hand pressed against her side, warm blood seeping through her fingers. Lockwood lay beside her, his smug expression finally gone, replaced with something else, something he wasn't used to feeling. Fear. Foster and Calloway rushed forward, securing Lockwood, while another agent dropped beside Rachel. "Stay with me, Monroe," the agent barked, applying pressure to her wound. Rachel gritted her teeth against the pain. "Tell me we got it," she murmured. Foster crouched down beside her, holding up a small, black recording device. "Every word," she confirmed. Rachel let out a weak chuckle, coughing slightly. "Then it was worth it." Lockwood turned his head toward her, his expression unreadable. "You think this ends with me?" he muttered. Rachel forced herself to look at him, her vision darkening at the edges. "No," she whispered. "But it starts with you." Lockwood didn't answer, because he knew she was right. Rachel Monroe woke up 2 days later in a hospital bed, and 4 in her arm, the steady beep of a heart monitor in her ears. Foster was there, waiting, watching. "You pulled through," she said simply. Rachel smirked weakly. Was there ever any doubt? Foster shook her head, but there was something new in her eyes. Respect. Rachel tried to sit up, but the pain in her side made her hiss. "You took a bullet for Lockwood," Foster reminded her. Rachel let out a dry chuckle. "Maybe I was hoping they'd aim better." Foster didn't smile. Instead, she set down a folder on Rachel's bedside table. Rachel frowned. "What's that?" Foster exhaled. "Lockwood flipped. Rachel's breath caught. He gave us names, Foster continued. Real names. The kind we've never been able to touch before. She hesitated. And he mentioned you. Rachel stilled. Foster slid the folder toward her. He says they won't let you walk away from this. Rachel's fingers hovered over the edge of the file. She had taken down Lockwood. But whoever was above him, they weren't done with her. She glanced at Foster. You offering me protection? Foster met her gaze. I'm offering you a job. Rachel blinked. Excuse me. You've seen what's out there, Foster said. You understand how deep this goes. You can either disappear, or you can help us finish what you started. Rachel stared at her. Then, a slow, tired smirk crossed her lips. Tell me more.